Hi, I'm Matt Grabicactus, and welcome back to Brash class. Today, we will be talking about Rip Van Winkle, a quintessential piece of American literature. Rip Van Winkle was written by Washington Irving, who was born on April 3rd, 1783 in New York City. As some of you intellectuals may know, that was just after the American Revolution. He was the last of 11 children and religiously read English literature, which became very apparent in the style and content of his writing. His many trips to Europe were also very influential because he would draw from his life experiences. Fun fact, he first went to Europe because he was showing signs of tuberculosis. Because he was deeply interested in culture and history, it makes sense that Irving's writing was most influenced by his time in Europe. He was generally acclaimed internationally, gaining the approval of Europeans. This is unusual at this time because Europeans disapproved of American literature. Though, to be fair, it's not like Europe and America had a perfect relationship. Anyone remember 1776? Irving's rise to international fame began when he was younger, before his trips to Europe. He published satirical essays in a variety of newspapers, notably the Morning Chronicle, a London newspaper owned by one of his brothers. Several of Irving's brothers were prolific poets, and it was common belief that he was inspired by their writing, ultimately influencing his decision to write. The most famous of Irving's works, however, came from his trip to Liverpool in 1815. This book is called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Cran Gent, or The Sketchbook for short. This book is so good that we didn't even bother getting the actual version. The sketchbook contained nearly 30 satirical short stories and essays, mostly concerning Irving's impressions of Europe. The most notable exceptions to this, however, are the Legends of Sleepy Hollow and, you guessed it, Rip Van Winkle, which are often described as the first American short stories. The sketchbook was a huge turning point for Irving, as it turned out to be, really successful. Oh my god, I can make a living on writing alone successful. So that's exactly what he did, publishing a sequel to the sketchbook 3 years later. One of the many strengths of Washington Irving as a writer was the ability to apply his own life experiences to his writing. In 1809, his fiancée, Matilda Hoffman, died of tuberculosis at age 17.
Mr. Grab-a-Cactus, what is it with this dude's life and tuberculosis? I feel like this isn't the first time I've heard about tuberculosis in the past 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's almost like tuberculosis was more common in the 19th century than it is today. Anyways, the death of Irving's fiancée was both devastating and a relief to him. He was, of course, heartbroken and never engaged, but part of the engagement was his commitment to study law, promised by Irving to Matilda's father. After Matilda's death, he was free to give up on law and work instead on something he actually cared about, pig farming.
No.
What? Oh yeah, writing. The interesting part about this is that this struggle between devastation and relief is expressed in Irving's writing, especially Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle is the story of a man, Rip Van Winkle, who lives in a small town near the Appalachian Mountains in the years before the American Revolutionary War. Rip is the type of person to work tirelessly for the benefit of others, but never for himself. Maybe I can get him to do this project for me. No, he's not real. I have to actually do work and stop being lazy? Oh, okay. While most of the village loves Rip for his hard-working attitude, his wife is less than approving. She correctly accuses him of putting in no work to take care of his family and farm. In fact, he's so unwilling to tend to his farm that it becomes overgrown and he has to give up on it entirely. This causes a problem in Rip's life, because while he's committed to a relationship with his wife, that's just her yelling at him. So he spends a lot of time in the forest hunting with his dog, away from his wife. Like a great husband. The story starts to get interesting when Rip decides to climb the nearby Catskill Mountains and meets a dwarf. The dwarf asks for help carrying a keg of alcohol, and while we all know the line, stranger danger, Rip foolishly accepts and follows him to a natural amphitheater where a crowd of odd-looking personages are playing a game of 9-pins? Anyways, upon delivering the keg of alcohol, he starts to stay for a while and sneaks a few drinks of alcohol, and he ends up drinking way too much alcohol and passes out and wakes up 20 years later. This is why you don't follow strangers into even stranger land, kids. Anyway, Rip wakes up alone in the mountains 20 years later with his trusty firearm replaced by a way less trusty firearm. Rip starts walking back to his village, dreading the foreseeable anger from his wife. After all, he thinks he's been asleep for one night. When he arrives at the village, he notices something isn't right immediately. The village is greatly expanded and he doesn't recognize any of the townspeople. Receiving looks from the townspeople for his now outdated clothing, Rip goes to his house in search for his wife. All he finds is a dog, whom Rip confuses for his own dog, Wolf. Next, he goes to the old tavern in search for anyone he knew. He immediately notices that the tavern is no longer a tavern and is now a hotel. Once he walks in, he is bombarded by townspeople asking if he's a Federalist or a Democrat. Confused, Rip declares his love to the great King George, like a traitor to the American government. It is in this hotel that Rip reconnects with his daughter, who is now a grown married woman. At this point, Rip realizes he's been asleep for 20 years, his wife and friends are dead, and he's been gone for an entire revolution. The story concludes with him falling back into the old rhythm, just with freedom away from his wife. He gains the love of the new villagers, and he tells stories of life before the war. He hasn't changed, and he serves as a relic of the past. So what's really going on here? Let's start with some basic text structure. The story is written formally in third person, narrated by Diedrich Knickerbocker. It focuses on Rip himself, leading to a disconnect between the reader and the other characters of the story. For example, Rip's wife is portrayed very negatively, while her nagging has very significant justification. Irving always wrote with humor, and that shines through in Rip Van Winkle. I mean, just look at his dog's name, Wolf. He sounds really scary, but Wolf is completely harmless. The reader's immediate interpretation does not match reality. Also, Rip's last name, Winkle, is very close to the term wink, which is commonly used when referring to falling asleep. This is Irving's way of foreshadowing Rip's 20-year nap. Isn't that just the cleverest thing? Irving writes stylistically in a way that makes you appreciate that some elements of Rip's environment change while others do not. For example, when Rip returns home and encounters a dog, the dog is immediately aggressive and way more worthy of the title Wolf. Yet when Rip finds out that the painting of King George has been replaced by a painting of George Washington, he can still find King George's face in the painting. This gives the reader a sense of continuity. In fact, the greatest message of Rip Van Winkle is revealed by how the story ends. Rip goes back to the way he was living before his time away. He doesn't change. Oh, what's that? It's time for the crypto artifacts, isn't it? Alright, hit me with it. A critical essay analyzing Rip Van Winkle by author and educator Cynthia Viley. Let's see what it says. Okay. Yeah. Well, this is interesting. It seems the formal language in the story allows for greater nuance in the text and can lead to multiple interpretations, just like LA rubrics. Riley is claiming that Rip Van Winkle follows the hero cycle. She brings up a good point. He does leave home, go on some adventure, and returns. But I'm going to have to disagree with her analysis. To us folk at Brash class, we feel for a character to follow the hero cycle, they need to experience a significant change. And in our analysis, Rip Van Winkle doesn't change at all. Viley also does mention that the story is more European than American, given its influence from German folklore, which I tend to agree with. It's good to look at a different perspective, but it seems like this scholar hasn't changed my position on theme or structure. Speaking of theme, let's try and collect these thoughts into a manageable idea. The lack of character development in Rip illustrates the idea that while life changes, there will always be relics of the past in society. The past is more relevant in the present than many believe. It's not just the hip new trend that phases out. In Rip Van Winkle's 20-year absence, a lot has changed. His small, quiet town has grown in popularity and size. The colonies have turned into the great United States of America, and everyone's talking about this new democratic government. But Rip Van Winkle, he's the same man as he used to be. Well, since we do have a 10-minute time limit, I think we should stop here. Hope you can join us next year for whatever piece of literature our teachers have us analyze. Good night.